Part 2, The Silent Princess. Lyra's World of Silence. Lyra had long grown accustomed to the silence that surrounded her. It wasn't just the absence of sound but the absence of agency, of choice, of freedom. Her father, Zorvax, had always seen her as a symbol of his own imperfection, a reminder that even the mighty could be flawed. Born without the use of her legs, Lyra had been confined to her floating chair, a sleek and cold piece of technology that symbolized both her limitations and her father's wealth. The grand hall was no different from any other day. She sat at the edge of the room, her golden eyes scanning the crowd with practiced detachment. She had learned early on that showing emotion only gave her father more ammunition for his cruelty. So, she remained silent, her face a mask of indifference, even as Zorvax offered her hand to the human commander like she was nothing more than a trinket. The human who defied. When Yarok refused her father's offer, Lyra felt something stir within her, a flicker of curiosity. She had expected her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. In his gaze, she saw something she hadn't seen in years, respect. Not pity, not disdain, but genuine respect. It was a small thing, but to Lyra, it felt like a spark in the darkness. A glimpse of hope. Later that night, Lyra found herself unable to sleep. Her chambers were lavish, filled with every luxury one could imagine, but they felt more like a prison than a home. She activated her chair and glided to the window, staring out at the sprawling city below. The lights of the capital flickered like stars, but Lyra knew the truth behind the glittering facade. The people were suffering, oppressed by her father's tyrannical rule. A soft knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Enter," she said, her voice calm but wary. To her surprise, it was Yarok. He stepped inside, his posture respectful but his eyes sharp with determination. "Princess Lyra," he began, "I apologize for intruding, but I needed to speak with you." An unlikely alliance. Lyra studied him for a moment before nodding. "You've already made quite an impression, Commander. What is it you want?" "I want to understand," Yarok replied. "Your father's offer was meant to humiliate both of us. But I refuse to believe you're content with this life." Lyra's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a glimpse of the pain and frustration she had buried deep within. "Content? No. But what choice do I have? My father sees me as a burden, and the court sees me as a joke. I have no power here." "You have more power than you realize," Yarok said, stepping closer. "You know your father's weaknesses. You understand the court's dynamics. If we work together, we can change things." The seeds of rebellion. Lyra's eyes narrowed. "You speak of rebellion. Do you understand the risks? My father is not a man to be crossed lightly." "I do," Yarok said firmly. "But I also understand that doing nothing is just as dangerous. Your people are suffering, Lyra. Don't you want to help them?" For the first time in years, Lyra felt a spark of hope. This human, this stranger, saw her not as a pawn or a burden but as an ally. It was a dangerous thought, but one she couldn't ignore. "What do you propose?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A plan takes shape. Yarok laid out his plan. He had been gathering information since his arrival, learning about the discontent among the people and the growing resentment toward Zorvax's rule. With Lyra's knowledge of the palace and her father's routines, they could strike at the heart of the empire. "It won't be easy," Yarok admitted. "But if we succeed, we can free your people and give them a chance at a better future." Lyra hesitated, her mind racing. She had spent her life in the shadows, avoiding her father's wrath. But now, for the first time, she saw a path forward, a chance to reclaim her life and her dignity. "I'll help you," she said finally. "But we must be careful. My father has eyes everywhere." A bond forged in silence. As Yarok left her chambers, Lyra felt a strange sense of relief. For years, she had been alone, trapped in a world that saw her as nothing more than a broken princess. But now, she had an ally, a human who saw her for who she truly was. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, but for the first time, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope. Together, she and Yarrick would challenge the might of the Zorvaxian Empire. And in doing so, they would prove that even the smallest spark could ignite a revolution. Part 4, The Battle of Wills. The Empire strikes back. The destruction of the supply depot sent shockwaves through the Zorvaxian Empire. Zorvax, enraged by the audacity of the rebels, declared martial law across the capital. His forces swept through the city, rounding up anyone suspected of dissent. The streets, once bustling with life, were now eerily silent, save for the heavy footsteps of soldiers and the occasional cry of protest. Lyra watched from her chambers, her heart heavy with guilt. She had known the risks, but seeing the suffering of her people firsthand was a harsh reminder of the stakes. She turned to Yarrick, who stood by the window, his expression grim. "We need to do something," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. "We can't let him punish innocent people for our actions." Yarrick nodded. "We will. But we need to be smart about it. Zorvax is expecting us to act out of emotion. We can't afford to play into his hands." A dangerous plan. The rebels gathered once again, this time in a hidden underground bunker beneath the city. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of recent events hanging heavily in the air. Yarrick addressed the group, his voice steady but filled with determination. "Zorvax is trying to break us," he said. "But we can't let him. We need to strike back, not just to retaliate, but to show the people that we're still here, that we're still fighting." The plan was risky. They would target Zorvax's communication hub, a heavily fortified facility that controlled the flow of information across the Empire. If they could disable it, they could disrupt Zorvax's ability to coordinate his forces and spread their own message of hope. Lyra's sacrifice. Lyra knew the plan would require her to play a dangerous role. As the princess, she had access to areas of the palace that were off-limits to others. She would need to infiltrate the communication hub from within, disabling its defenses so that Yarrick and the rebels could launch their attack. "It's too dangerous," Yarrick argued when she presented the idea. "If Zorvax catches you..." "He won't," Lyra interrupted, her voice firm. "I know the risks, but this is the only way. We need to hit him where it hurts, and I'm the only one who can get us inside." Yarrick hesitated, but he knew she was right. Reluctantly, he agreed. The infiltration. The night of the operation, Lyra moved through the palace with practiced ease. Her floating chair glided silently through the halls, her expression calm despite the storm raging within her. She reached the communication hub, a massive structure of glowing panels and humming machinery, and began her work. Using her knowledge of the palace's systems, she disabled the security measures one by one. Her heart pounded with every passing second, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Outside, Yarrick and the rebels waited for her signal. When it came, a faint flicker of light from a high window, they moved in. The battle begins. The rebels stormed the hub, their movements swift and precise. Yarrick led the charge, his weapon drawn as he fought his way through Zorvax's guards. The facility was a maze of corridors and control rooms, but they had studied the layout carefully. Lyra watched from a control panel, her fingers flying over the keys as she worked to disable the hub's core systems. The sound of blaster fire echoed through the halls, each shot a reminder of the danger they were in. Zorvax's wrath. Word of the attack reached Zorvax quickly. The king's fury was unmatched as he ordered his elite guards to the hub. "Bring me the traitors alive," he snarled. "I want to make an example of them." The rebels fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered. Yarrick knew they couldn't hold out much longer. "Lyra, we need to go," he shouted over the chaos. "Just a few more seconds," she replied, her voice strained. With a final keystroke, the hub systems shut down, plunging the facility into darkness. A narrow escape. Yarrick grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her toward the exit. The rebels covered their retreat, their determination unwavering even as Zorvax's forces closed in. They emerged into the night, the city's skyline lit by the glow of distant fires. The communication hub was in ruins, its once mighty structure now a smoldering wreck. A message of hope. As the rebels regrouped in the safety of their hideout, Lyra activated a small device. Across the Empire, screens flickered to life, displaying a message of defiance. People of the Zorvaxian Empire, her voice rang out, clear and strong. You are not alone. We fight for you, for a future free from fear and oppression. Together, we can overthrow the tyrant who rules us. Together, we can reclaim our freedom. The message spread like wildfire, igniting a spark of hope in the hearts of the oppressed. Zorvax's grip on the Empire was weakening, and the rebellion was growing stronger by the day. The battle continues. Yarrick turned to Lyra, his expression a mix of pride and concern. You did it, he said. But Zorvax won't stop. He'll come after us with everything he has. Lyra met his gaze, her golden eyes filled with determination. Let him come. We're ready. Part 3, The Rebellion Spark. The Hidden Network. In the days following their clandestine meeting, Yarrick and Lyra began to lay the groundwork for their rebellion. The Zorvaxian Empire was vast, its reach extending across countless star systems, but its core was rotten. Zorvax's rule was maintained through fear and oppression, and the people were growing restless. Lyra proved to be an invaluable ally. Her knowledge of the palace's layout, her understanding of her father's routines, and her connections within the court gave them a significant advantage. She introduced Yarrick to a network of dissidents, servants, soldiers, and even a few disillusioned nobles who had grown tired of Zorvax's tyranny. The first meeting. Their first meeting took place in the depths of the palace, in a forgotten storage room hidden behind a tapestry. The air was thick with tension as Yarrick addressed the small group. We all know why we're here, he began, his voice low but firm. Zorvax's rule has brought nothing but suffering. But change won't come from waiting. It will come from action. The dissidents exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a young soldier named Kale, spoke up. And what action do you propose, Commander? Zorvax's forces are vast, and his spies are everywhere. How do we stand against that? We start small, Yarrick replied. We gather information, we sabotage their operations, and we spread the truth. The people are already discontent. We just need to give them a reason to rise up. Lyra's role. Lyra stepped forward, her golden eyes gleaming with determination. My father's strength lies in his control. He thrives on fear and division. But if we can show the people that there's another way, that they're not alone, we can weaken his hold. The group nodded, their resolve hardening. They knew the risks, but they also knew that doing nothing was no longer an option. A dangerous game. Over the next few weeks, Yarrick and Lyra worked tirelessly to expand their network. They used coded messages and hidden signals to communicate, always careful to avoid Zorvax's spies. Lyra's position as the princess gave them access to valuable information, but it also made her a target. One evening, as Lyra was returning to her chambers, she was intercepted by her father's chief advisor, a cold and calculating man named Valen. Princess Lyra, Valen said, his voice dripping with false politeness. Your father has noticed your increased activity. He's concerned for your well-being. Lyra's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. Tell my father I appreciate his concern, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. Valen's eyes narrowed. Of course, princess. But remember, the king's patience is not infinite. A close call. The encounter left Lyra shaken. She knew her father's patience was wearing thin, and she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She relayed the incident to Yarrick, who immediately tightened their security measures. "We need to accelerate our plans," Yarrick said. "If Zorvax suspects anything, we won't get a second chance." Lyra agreed. They decided to target one of Zorvax's key supply depots, a facility that provided weapons and resources to his armies. If they could disrupt its operations, it would send a clear message to the people that Zorvax was not invincible. The first strike. The night of the operation, Yarrick and a small team of rebels infiltrated the depot. Lyra stayed behind, using her access to the palace's systems to disable the security measures. The mission was a success. The depot was left in ruins, and the rebels escaped without a trace. But the victory came at a cost. Zorvax was furious, and he launched a brutal crackdown on the city, arresting anyone suspected of dissent. A growing movement. Despite the risks, the rebellion continued to grow. The people were inspired by the audacity of the rebels, and whispers of hope began to spread. Yarrick and Lyra knew they were playing a dangerous game, but they also knew they couldn't turn back. As they prepared for their next move, Lyra found herself reflecting on how far they had come. She had spent her life in the shadows, but now she was at the forefront of a movement that could change the fate of the Empire. "We're making a difference," she said to Yarrick one evening. "But the hardest part is yet to come." Yarrick nodded. "We'll face it together. No matter what happens, we've already shown that Zorvax's power isn't absolute." The spark ignites. The rebellion was no longer just a spark, it was a flame, growing brighter with each passing day. Yarrick and Lyra knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but they were ready. Together, they would challenge the might of the Zorvaxian Empire and fight for a future where no one had to live in fear. Part 1: The King's Mockery. The Grand Hall of Zorvax. The Grand Hall of Zorvax, the alien king, was a spectacle of opulence and power. Towering pillars of obsidian stone stretched toward a ceiling adorned with glowing crystals, casting an eerie light over the gathered elite. The air was thick with the scent of exotic spices and the low hum of whispered conversations. At the center of it all sat Zorvax, his massive frame draped in robes of shimmering gold, his piercing red eyes scanning the room with a mix of arrogance and disdain. Commander Yarrick stood before him, his human form a stark contrast to the alien figures surrounding him. He had come to negotiate peace, but it was clear Zorvax had other plans. The mocking offer. "You have done well, human," Zorvax said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Your efforts to save my people from the plague were commendable. And so, I have decided to reward you." Yarrick's eyes narrowed. He had heard tales of Zorvax's cruel sense of humor, and he braced himself for what was to come. "I grant you the hand of my daughter, Lyra, in marriage," Zorvax declared, his lips curling into a smirk. The room erupted into murmurs. Some laughed, others sneered, and a few exchanged knowing glances. Yarrick's gaze shifted to the far side of the chamber, where a lone figure sat in silence. The silent princess. Lyra was unlike the other nobles. Her silver hair cascaded over one shoulder, and her golden eyes stared ahead with an unreadable expression. She sat in a sleek, metallic floating chair, her posture regal yet distant. It was clear she was not here by choice. Yarrick's heart ached for her. He understood the cruelty of Zorvax's offer. This was no reward, it was a mockery. Lyra, an amputee, was being treated as a burden, a pawn in her father's twisted game. A stand for dignity. "Counselor Zorvax," Yarrick said, his voice steady. "I do not believe a person's life is something to be given as a reward." The room fell silent. Zorvax's smirk faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You refuse my generosity?" "I refuse to treat another person as property," Yarrick replied, his gaze unwavering. For the first time, Lyra moved. Her head turned slightly, her golden eyes meeting Jarek's. In them, he saw not gratitude, but curiosity. The spark of rebellion. As the tension in the room grew, Jarek realized this was more than a personal stand. It was a spark, a moment that could ignite a rebellion. Zorvax's cruelty had pushed his people to the brink, and Jarek's defiance might just be the catalyst they needed. But for now, he stood alone, facing the wrath of an alien king.